Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to really pull apart some incredibly detailed source material, extracting the key knowledge and honestly some pretty surprising insights. Today, we're taking on something huge, a deep dive into biblical prophecy, specifically focusing on the return of Jesus.
Right.
But, and this is important, we're not doing it by just grabbing isolated verses here and there. Our mission today is to uncover the vast Old Testament backstory, the framework for the whole thing.
That's absolutely key.
Yeah.
You know, for such a long time, the end times, the culmination of the ages, it's often treated almost like it's purely a New Testament idea, sort of detached from its roots.
Yeah, exactly.
And the sources we're looking at today, they force us to go way back to the foundational story for Israel, the Exodus, if we really want to grasp the ultimate triumph. We're dealing with material that sees the second coming not just as one event, but as the final, really dramatic fulfillment of a super ancient covenant, the one made at Mount Sinai.
Okay, so we're talking deliverance, judgment, restoration, the big themes, but viewing it all through the specific lens of ancient Jewish context and connecting the prophetic dots.
Precisely. And what ties it all together across thousands of years of scripture? What makes it one coherent story?
That's the question. What is it?
Well, the central idea, and it might surprise you, is that this whole redemptive story, from the very beginning right to the very end, is actually framed as the renewal of a divine marriage covenant.
A marriage covenant.
Yes. The Exodus from Egypt, that gathering at Sinai, that was the original proposal, the betrothal ceremony. If you miss the romance, the sources argue, you basically miss the whole point of the final restoration.
A divine betrothal at Sinai. Okay, that definitely reframes it. It's not just about God giving laws then. It's foundational, a relationship contract. So let's start right there. How exactly is that covenant at Sinai like a legal marriage or betrothal?
Well, first you have to grasp the scope. The Lord's plan, the one to redeem the whole world, which eventually leads to global restoration. It started exclusively with Israel.
Right.
Jesus himself, remember, said salvation is from the Jews. So this picture, this analogy of the divine husband in Israel as the covenanted bride, it's established way, way before the New Testament even picks it up.
And the sources call the Exodus period the courtship. Makes sense in this context. And part of that courtship involved God showing his power over Egypt's gods. You mentioned the sources specify 11 signs, not the usual 10 plagues.
That distinction is actually pretty crucial. It wasn't just 10 random disasters. The 11 signs were YHVH, God, systematically waging war against the entire Egyptian pantheon, like one by one.
Okay.
The goal was really twofold. First, break Pharaoh's power, obviously. But second, demonstrate his absolute singular superiority to his prospective bride, Israel. It was this overwhelming display of commitment, like saying, look, I will save you with immense power and I will provide for you compassionately. You see that with the quail, the manna, right there in the barren desert.
Right, winning their trust.
Exactly. He won their confidence through these mighty, undeniable acts before the proposal.
So that courtship phase ends. Israel arrives at Mount Sinai about 3 months after leaving Egypt, right? How does the actual proposal happen?
So at Sinai, YHVH makes it formal. He proposes the covenant. And he promises them something completely unique. In Exodus 19.5, he says, basically, if you obey my voice, keep my covenant, then you, out of all peoples, will be my segula.
Segula. Okay, I know that's often translated treasured possession, but you're saying the sources suggest it means much more in that ancient context.
Oh, definitely. It's not just like general wealth or something nice. Segula specifically refers to a king's personal, private treasury. The stuff he keeps for himself, his most prized, non-negotiable assets. Think crown jewels, personal favorites.
Well,
So YHVH was declaring, out of all the nations on earth, you, Israel, will be my crown jewel, my most exclusive, most treasured possession. That promise, that's the heart of the proposal.
and how did the people respond?
Instantly, enthusiastically, they declared, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And here's the kicker. They said yes before they even heard all the detailed terms and conditions.
Okay, impulsive maybe, but definitely acceptance.
Right. And this brings us to the legal side. You really have to ditch the modern idea of engagement. In the ancient Near East, they entered into betrothal. And betrothal was legally binding. They were considered married from that point.
So infidelity during betrothal.
Legally actionable as adultery. Full stop.
Okay, so the stakes were incredibly high right from the get-go, even before the main ceremony. Let's talk about that ceremony, the divine arrival. How detailed is the description of YHVH, the bridegroom, showing up?
It's depicted as this visible theophany, a physical manifestation of God's presence. Exodus 19, verses 16 to 20, paints this incredible picture. YHVH arrives at Sinai amidst just staggering phenomena. Intense thunder, bolts of lightning, a thick, dark cloud blanketing the mountain.
Sounds terrifying.
And a tremendously loud trumpet sound. One that just kept getting louder and louder. The whole mountain was shrouded in smoke and fire because the Lord descended on it in fire. I mean, this wasn't a quiet, subtle thing. It was a cosmic wedding entrance, designed to convey absolute majesty, overwhelming power, and importantly, exclusivity.
And the marriage contract. The ketubah, as you called it.
That's the 10 Commandments. They function as the summary, the essence of the wedding vows, and the legal framework for the entire relationship. They're like the core distillation of the whole Torah. And their legal status is just unparalleled because they're the only part of the covenant written by God's own finger, etched onto stone tablets. They represent the supreme, unchangeable terms of this marriage agreement.
And looking at those terms, the first two commandments about exclusivity seem especially pointed in this marital context you're describing.
They absolutely are. They define the relationship itself. The very first commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me," immediately establishes this as absolutely exclusive. YHVH isn't interested in sharing his bride. He explicitly defines himself as a jealous God.
Which sounds negative to us, maybe.
But in this context, it's not presented as a human flaw. It's the righteous demand for singular devotion. The devotion owed by the bride, Israel, to the divine bridegroom.
And think about where the contract ended up. Those two stone tablets of the 10 Commandments literally served as the official marriage certificate.
Right.
And they were housed eventually in the Ark of the Covenant, which was placed right in the Holy of Holies, the absolute heart and center of the entire theocratic kingdom. The marriage certificate was at the core of the nation's existence.
That structure just screams permanent stability.
Yeah.
Yet, the sources point out the breach, the violation, happened almost instantly, the golden calf incident.
Yeah.
How fast did Israel break that exclusivity vow?
It's actually shocking how quickly Moses is still up on the mountain, literally receiving the detailed terms of the contract. He's still getting the paperwork.
Pretty much. And the people down below, in their impatience, they basically decide to commit covenantal adultery. The sources really highlight this, the great sin that Moses confronts Aaron about. That's not just a description of bad behavior. It's a specific legal term found in Egyptian marriage contracts at the time that always referred to adultery.
Wow.
So Israel was effectively immediately cheating on their newly betrothed husband in the most egregious way.
And the divine bridegroom's reaction, ready to end it right there.
Absolutely. YHVH stated his intention, flat out, destroy the entire nation and start over just with Moses.
Moses steps in.
Moses intervenes, yeah. He acts almost like God's lawyer, but also the agent of judgment. He doesn't plead Israel's innocence because they weren't innocent. Instead, he appeals to God's own reputation among the surrounding nations. What would they say? And he reminds God of the unconditional covenant promises made way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
And Aaron's excuse for making the calf that just sort of came out of the fire, that doesn't hold water, does it?
Oh, the source material calls it contemptible. It's just a pathetic attempt to shift blame, right? Like it was some magical accident, not a deliberate act of rebellion and idolatry. Moses saw right through it, of course, and executed judgment immediately on the ringleaders. It showed that even though the covenant was breached, it still carried legal weight. Consequences were real.
But somehow, despite this huge breach, the relationship was renewed. How did mercy win out? How did YHVH reestablish things?
Well, it took Moses' deepest, most intense intercession. It culminates in that famous moment where YHVH reveals the fullness of his character, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth. Based on that character, the marriage covenant was restored. You see it at Exodus 34.9. Moses actually carves the renewed contract, the 10 Commandments, again onto new stone tablets.
Okay, so a second chance.
A second chance, yes. But the tragic pattern of human failure, the bride's inability to stay faithful on her own, that pattern was now set.
Which implies the ultimate fix couldn't just be more rules on stone, it had to look forward prophetically.
That's exactly right. Much later, the prophet Jeremiah looks back at this whole Sinai episode, the breach, the renewal, and he casts the new covenant, Jeremiah 31, not as getting rid of the old marriage altogether, but as a total renewal, an upgrade, really.
How is it superior?
Because the new covenant directly addresses the root problem, the bride's unfaithful heart. It promises to put God's law and his own spirit inside Israel, fundamentally changing them, enabling them to finally remain faithful forever. It's about heart transformation, so they can never again commit that great sin of turning away.
Okay, so that future faithfulness enabled by the Spirit, that's the ultimate goal. But what about the meantime? Between Sinai and that future fulfillment, unfaithfulness, you said, leads to this predictable cycle of covenant chastisement.
Yes, it's a very clear repeating pattern. You see it laid out in the law, like in Deuteronomy, and then echoed constantly by the prophets. First, there's rebellion, usually involving idolatry, breaking that first commandment again.
Yeah.
Second, as a consequence, YHVH withdraws his divine protection. That leads to various calamities, famine, disease, drought. Third, if the rebellion persists, comes invasion by foreign enemies, leading eventually to exile, scattering Israel among the peoples, as Deuteronomy 4 puts it.
That's scattering. It's the direct opposite of the original promise of multiplication, isn't it?
That's tragic antithesis, yeah. Instead of becoming numerous like the stars, they become few in number. This vulnerable minority dispersed across the globe. But, crucially, even in scattering, the promise of eventual restoration remains.
Which brings us right up to the end times. The sources describe this final period as the last, most intense turn of that cycle, right?
Yeah.
A final chastisement just before the ultimate restoration.
That's what's known as the time of Jacob's trouble, or Jacob's distress. Jeremiah chapter 30, verses 5 to 7, gives this stark warning. He describes it as a day of unparalleled terror and dread, saying there's none like it.
He uses some pretty visceral imagery, too.
He does. Men clutching their sides like women in labor. It's a symbol of absolute agonizing fear and distress. This is the final, the greatest, the most severe corrective action before the Messiah intervenes.
And Daniel adds more specifics to this, doesn't he? What makes this time of tribulation so unique, so unprecedented?
Yeah, the angel Gabriel specified to Daniel that this period of distress would be such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. That defines its scale. It's globally unique in its severity. Nothing in history compares.
And Daniel connects it chronologically, too.
Yes, Daniel 12, verse 1, immediately links this specific unprecedented calamity to the time just before the resurrection of the dead, which means it's the terminal event of this current age. It's the last thing before the end.
Is there a specific duration mentioned?
There is. The duration is giving as a time, times, and half a time. This is a specific prophetic measure that's pretty much universally understood, especially in Jewish interpretation, to mean 3.5 years, or 42 months.
So it's intense, but it's finite.
Exactly. That fixed duration provides a clear time frame. It marks the countdown to the end of the age, and crucially, the Messiah's intervention to save them.
The prophecies also seem to zoom in on Jerusalem as the geographical bullseye for this distress. What does Zechariah foresee happening right there?
The Zechariah 14 paints this picture of a massive climactic end times invasion. Armies from many nations gather specifically against Jerusalem for battle.
And the outcome?
It's devastating. The city is captured, homes are plundered, women are violated, and Zechariah is incredibly precise. Exactly half the city's remaining population goes into exile. It's like this final brutal act of international aggression that nearly wipes out the Jewish presence there.
But the sequence is important, you mentioned.
Vitally important. The invasion happens first. The distress hits its absolute peak. Then and only then does the Lord himself go forth to fight against those specific invading nations. The chastisement reaches its apex just before the divine deliverance arrives.
Okay, that sets the stage for the ultimate confrontation. But before we jump into the triumphant return itself, we really need to tackle this major theological fork in the road you mentioned, the one that dictates how people even read this whole prophetic roadmap.
Right, this is section 4 in our outline, and it's critical. It's the divide between supersessionism, which is often called replacement theology, and restorationism.
Yeah.
Understanding the fundamental difference here is absolutely paramount because it determines whether you interpret all these prophecies we've been discussing as literal future events centered on Israel or just as spiritual metaphors for the church.
Okay, let's start with the restorationist view. The sources say it's based on a straightforward, natural reading of the text. What's the core belief there?
Restorationism is fundamentally about covenantal fidelity. It holds that God means what he says, basically. The promises he made unconditionally to Israel, think Abrahamic, Mosaic, Davidic covenants, promises concerning the literal land, their national identity, the future earthly kingdom. Restorationism believes these will be literally fulfilled, meaning a real established Jewish kingdom in the actual land promised, with the Messiah physically ruling on the throne of David in Jerusalem, just like the texts describe it, without spiritualizing it away.
Okay, clear enough. Now, supersessionism takes a fundamentally different track. The idea is that the New Covenant somehow makes all those Old Testament promises about land and nation obsolete, right? And transfers Israel's blessings primarily to the church, seen as the new Israel.
Exactly. And this is where the source material we're looking at becomes highly critical. It really takes issue with the logic sometimes used to uphold that supersessionist view. They specifically call out the infamous horse and buggy analogy.
The horse and buggy analogy, explain that one.
It's the idea put forth by some supersessionists that God originally promised Israel something basic, maybe even primitive, the horse and buggy, representing the literal land and national kingdom. But then with the new covenant, he delivered something far superior, more modern, the automobile, representing a purely spiritual inheritance for the church. The implication is the old promise was kind of inferior, outdated.
That sounds like imposing a human value judgment on God's promises. And the sources argue against this by pointing to the geography.
Precisely. The argument restorationists make, based on the sources, is if God always intended the land promised to be purely spiritual or symbolic, why did he go to the trouble of defining it with literal and natural boundary markers?
Good point.
The sources hammer this home. God specified the promised land stretched from the Euphrates River in the east to the Great Sea, the Mediterranean in the west, and down to the River of Egypt in the south. These aren't vague spiritual concepts, they're real geographical coordinates.
So using those coordinates is proof the promise was physical, national.
That's the argument. It was intended as a physical national inheritance, not just some ethereal spiritual state. Therefore, the sources conclude, supersessionism isn't just a different interpretation. They argue it actually subverts, meaning it overthrows, corrupts the explicit, unconditional promises God made to the Jewish people. It effectively strips them of their promised national destiny and, in a way, their very identity as defined by those covenants.
And the sources don't stop at theology. They connect this theological viewpoint, this divestment of Israel's promises, directly to the long, often brutal history of anti-Semitism that developed within parts of the historical church.
Yes, the connection drawn is stark and, frankly, chillingly detailed in the material. It points to early church fathers, influential figures like Chrysostom and Jerome, who actively promoted the idea that God had rejected the Jewish people and consigned them to perpetual slavery, specifically for their role in the death of Jesus.
But the sources challenge that specific accusation, don't they?
They challenge it head on. They remind readers that the prophet Isaiah, centuries before Jesus, stated unequivocally that the Messiah's suffering was for the sins of all humanity. Isaiah 53.6 says, "The Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him." So blaming one specific nation for an event required for universal atonement. Well, the sources argue that created a deeply flawed and dangerous theological pretext for hostility.
And once Christianity became intertwined with state power, particularly under the Roman Empire, these theological views started shaping actual policy, didn't they?
That's exactly the progression outlined. You see this immediate shift towards what can only be called state-sponsored discrimination and persecution. Constantine, soon after legalizing Christianity, banned Jews from even entering Jerusalem around AD 315.
Wow.
Then you have instances like synagogues being destroyed across the Roman Empire in AD 388, often with the incitement or approval of local bishops. Later came formal legal decrees, things like prohibiting Jews from holding public office or even appearing in public during the highly Christianized Easter season, reinforcing that harmful Christ killer narrative.
The sources also mention the infamous identifying badge that Jews were forced to wear later on. That wasn't a Nazi invention either.
No, the sources are very blunt about this. The yellow badge used by the Nazis was tragically just an adaptation of a long-established Christian practice. And even that practice, they note, likely borrowed from earlier Islamic legal requirements imposed on non-Muslims, like the Pact of Omar around 640 AD.
So when did it become formalized in Christian Europe?
The practice of forcing Jews to wear special distinguishing clothing, or specifically a yellow badge, often an oval shape initially, was mandated across Christian Europe by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 AD. It was explicitly designed as a tool for separation, humiliation, and social control.
Leading to the devastating conclusion the source material draws about the connection between this long history and the Holocaust.
Yes. The argument presented is that Hitler's virulent Jew hatred, while obviously secularized and based on racist ideology, didn't arise in a vacuum. It tapped into and was arguably a secular culmination of what had become over centuries a typical Christian attitude, rooted in this supersessionist tradition of viewing Jews as rejected and cursed. The sources make the provocative claim that the Holocaust itself would have been impossible without the almost 2,000 years prehistory of Christian anti-Judaism.
That is a profound and deeply unsettling charge, a warning about where theology can lead.
It is. It functions as a stark, self-critical warning within the material about the real-world consequences of theological arrogance and misinterpretation, particularly regarding God's ongoing purposes for Israel.
Which brings us right back to the New Testament itself, and perhaps the most direct warning about Gentile attitudes towards Israel, the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 11. What's the core message there that Gentile believers are supposed to take to heart?
Paul uses that famous metaphor of the olive tree. Israel is the natural tree, the cultivated branches. Gentile believers are like branches from a wild olive tree that have been grafted in, where some of the natural branches were temporarily broken off due to unbelief.
Okay.
And Paul issues this incredibly explicit warning directly to the Gentile believers. Do not become arrogant or conceited towards the original natural branches, the Jewish people. He stresses that Israel's partial hardening, their temporary unbelief, was part of God's plan specifically to allow Gentiles to be grafted in, to receive salvation.
So gratitude, not arrogance, should be the response.
Exactly. And the warning is severe. Paul says if Gentiles fall into that same trap of pride and arrogance against the root, they themselves risk being cut off from the tree, a phrase implying potential separation from God's covenant of life and blessings. It powerfully underscores that how Gentile believers relate to Israel and God's promises to them is actually foundational to their own standing before God.
That really sets a critical tone as we move into the final act of this whole redemption story, the triumphant return. This has to reverse that long history of scattering caused by unfaithfulness and, sadly, fueled by some of these theological errors.
It's framed as the second Exodus, and it's prophesied to be even greater, even more overtly miraculous than the first Exodus from Egypt. The prophet Micah explicitly confirms this pattern, saying, "As in the days when you came out from the land of Egypt, I will show you miracles." That's Micah 7.15.
And this is a physical return, not just spiritual.
Oh, absolutely physical, according to the sources. It depicts a literal regathering of the Jewish people back to the land of Israel from every corner of the earth where they've been scattered. Not just a spiritual awakening, but a geographical homecoming.
Now, how did the desert prophecies you mentioned earlier give us more detail, maybe the logistics of this divine return?
Right. This is a really unique set of Old Testament texts. You find them in places like Deuteronomy 33, the Song of Deborah, in Judges 5, Habakkuk chapter 3. What's fascinating is how consistently they portray YHVH's physical movement.
How so?
They consistently depict YHVH as the divine warrior who is coming or marching from the south. The starting point is explicitly identified as Mount Sinai, or sometimes Mount Paran, which is in the same region. And the direction of movement is always northward.
Northward towards where? And what's the significance of that route?
The road is critical. He moves northward through the desert regions known anciently as Seir, Teman, and Edom. These are territories historically associated with Israel's enemies. So this march isn't just a journey. It symbolizes the final act of judgment against those historical adversaries who occupied the path between Sinai and the Promised Land.
So it's a war march.
It is. It's a war march, heading directly toward the Promised Land and ultimately Mount Zion and Jerusalem. It fulfills the promise the same Creator God who established order out of chaos at Sinai is now returning to definitively reestablish His perfect order over a world that has fallen back into chaos and rebellion.
And this arrival, the second Exodus arrival, it must mirror the first arrival at Sinai, thematically at least.
Absolutely, it has to. It's the ultimate reunion ceremony, the consummation of the marriage. The arrival is characterized by all the same powerful, awe-inspiring elements we saw at Sinai. Intense fire, dramatic storm clouds, that mighty trumpet sound which Paul connects to the final resurrection, and a great earth-shattering earthquake.
The bridegroom returns.
The bridegroom returns, yes, but this time not just as the proposer, but as the conquering king, ready to claim his throne and his bride.
How does the actual procession work? You mentioned Isaiah talks about a highway.
Yeah, Isaiah 35 gives this incredible prophecy of a massive, miraculously constructed highway appearing right through the barren desert. It's called the Highway of Holiness.
Okay.
And this highway is specifically prepared for God himself and for the redeemed exiles to travel on as they return. The prophecy even says the scorched earth around it will transform into pools of water, blossoming with life. So the journey itself is part of the restoration.
It's more than just transportation then.
Much more. And Psalm 68 adds another layer. It describes this return as a holy procession, like God himself marching into his sanctuary, into Zion. It's pictured as this massive, joyous parade, complete with singers and musicians, celebrating the enthronement of the victorious king.
But that procession imagery, it's complex, isn't it? It's not just about ceremony, it's about liberation for the oppressed, too.
Indeed. The sources emphasize this dual aspect. The returning king is simultaneously leading the former prisoners out with joyful singing. He's setting the lonely and displaced into families, and he's bringing complete recompense and restoration for the poor and the oppressed, especially those who endured the horrors of the time of Jacob's trouble.
And physical healing is part of that.
Yes, dramatically so. One of the greatest signs of this total renewal during the procession is widespread physical healing. The blind regain sight, the deaf hear, the mute shout for joy, and the lame leap like deer as they joyfully march towards Zion. It's total restoration, body and soul.
Now, we have to shift gears slightly. Address the other side of the coin. The militant imagery of the returning Messiah, the crusher, the judge, that seems like a stark contrast.
It is a stark contrast, but it's absolutely central to fulfilling the justice aspect of the covenant promises. Isaiah 63 gives the most graphic, frankly shocking depiction. It portrays the divine warrior arriving from Edom, that enemy territory south of Judah and Gagari. His garments are described as dyed or stained crimson red with the blood of his enemies. He explicitly says he has trodden them underfoot like grapes in a winepress. This imagery of the divine warrior crushing his foes, he's sometimes referred to literally as the crushing one in the prophets, like in Psalm 68.21 or Habakkuk 3.1, it's repeated. This is divine judgment, pure and simple, executed against worldwide rebellion concentrated in the armies opposing him.
Okay, but how do you reconcile that image with the Jesus of the Gospels, the suffering servant, the one who taught turning the other cheek? They seem almost incompatible.
That's the tension, isn't it? But the sources insist you must hold both images together to get the full picture. The first coming was necessarily focused on atonement, on suffering for sin to provide forgiveness. The second coming is necessarily focused on establishing sovereignty and executing final justice against unrepentant sin and rebellion.
Two phases of the same mission.
Exactly. The sources are clear. The purpose of this crushing isn't vengeance for its own sake. It's to definitively end organized evil, systemic injustice, and open rebellion against God forever, paving the way for the peaceful messianic kingdom to be established.
And this judgment has a particularly grim end for the armies that gathered against Jerusalem, the one Zechariah mentioned.
Yes, it culminates in what Revelation 19 calls the Great Supper of God. Ezekiel 39 also describes it. It's this horrific scene where the birds of the air and the beasts of the field are invited by God to feast on the corpses of the defeated armies of the Antichrist and the nations allied with him.
A symbolic reversal.
An ultimate symbolic reversal of power, yes. It graphically demonstrates God's absolute victory over all earthly and demonic opposition that dare to challenge his rule and harm his people.
Let's bring this back to the New Testament for a moment. How does Jesus' own description of his return, say in the Gospels, connect with these very specific Old Testament themes of theophany and the divine warrior?
The connection is incredibly strong. The sources argue that Jesus' description of his return coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory, sending angels with a great trumpet sound to gather his elect, is almost entirely rooted in the imagery of the theophany in Mount Sinai and these later desert prophecies, especially filtered through Daniel chapter 7's vision of the Son of Man.
So when he talked about coming on clouds,
he wasn't just using generic apocalyptic language. He was specifically claiming the identity of the Cloud Rider, a known title for YHVH in Ugaritic texts in the Old Testament. He was identifying himself as the divine warrior whom Moses saw coming in radiant glory from Sinai, the one Daniel saw receiving the everlasting kingdom. For his original Jewish audience, steeped in these scriptures, the connections would have been immediate and profound. This wasn't abstract theology. It was rooted, contextual Jewish prophecy.
Okay, so the arrival is dramatic, judgmental, and fulfilling ancient prophecy. What's the ultimate outcome? Once the dust settles, what happens specifically for Israel? The sources talk about a profound spiritual and national transformation.
Yes, the return triggers this pivotal moment of national repentance for Israel. Zechariah chapter 12 gives the most detailed description. He says, YHVH will pour out a spirit of grace and of supplication, specifically on the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the survivors of the tribulation.
And what happens then?
In that moment of divine enablement, they will look on me whom they have pierced. They recognize Jesus as their Messiah, the one rejected and crucified. And this recognition leads to bitter, nationwide mourning, like the mourning for a firstborn son. It's this deep corporate repentance for centuries of national rejection.
And this national salvation of Israel, it's not just an isolated event, is it? Paul connects it to the bigger picture, the Gentile mission.
That's the glorious convergence. Paul, in Romans 11, explicitly states that Israel's eventual national salvation is linked to the fullness of the Gentiles having come in. It's like the completion of the Gentile harvest triggers the restoration of Israel, and together, this sets the stage for the final act, the establishment of the physical earthly kingdom. It demonstrates God's unwavering faithfulness to all his promises, both the spiritual ones involving the Gentiles and the national land-based ones involving Israel.
Okay, the Messianic kingdom. This is where Jesus finally takes the throne of David. How exactly does that fulfill the ancient Davidic covenant?
The Davidic covenant, given in 2 Samuel chapter 7, was an unconditional promise to King David. God swore that David would have a descendant whose throne and kingdom would be established forever.
Right.
So when Jesus, the son of David, the rightful King Messiah, returns, he will take his physical place on the actual throne of his ancestor David, ruling from Jerusalem. This literally fulfills that ancient unbreakable promise. And this kingdom he establishes is characterized by just unbelievable restoration and physical prosperity, things that defy natural law as we know it.
Can you give some examples of that prosperity? You mentioned agriculture earlier. It sounds almost fantastical.
It really does. Sure. Amos chapter 9, verses 13 to 15 gives this picture of agricultural abundance so extreme that the plowman literally overtakes the reaper, meaning the harvest comes up so fast and so abundantly that the person sowing the next crop is right behind the person still harvesting the previous one. There's no gap. He says the mountains will drip sweet wine, the hills will flow with milk, and those cities ruined during the tribulation, they'll be instantly rebuilt and inhabited. It's portrayed as a state of perpetual Eden-like blessing and bounty, directly flowing from the presence of the king.
And that original marriage covenant, the one made at Sinai, finally finds its perfect eternal fulfillment.
Yes, this is the ultimate consummation. The relationship reaches its glorious intended culmination. Isaiah chapter 4, verse 5 says, "The very glory of God, the Shekinah, will visibly cover Mount Zion like a vast wedding canopy, a chuppah, just like the thick cloud covered Mount Sinai during the first covenant ceremony."
And Isaiah 62.4 even says Israel will be called Hephzibah, my delight is in her, and Beulah, married.
Exactly. It signifies the completed, perfected new covenant marriage. That foundational declaration, "I will be your God and you will be my people," is finally, irrevocably, eternally established in its fullest sense.
That restoration, that fulfilled marriage, leads naturally to celebration, the ultimate global party, the wedding feast.
Precisely. Isaiah chapter 25 prophesies this lavish banquet for all peoples, held on this mountain, meaning Mount Zion. This isn't just any feast. The source is connected directly back to that covenant meal eaten by Moses and the elders on Mount Sinai in Exodus 24, the meal that sealed the original contract.
So it's a covenant renewal feast.
It is. And Jesus himself confirmed this future event. He taught the Gentiles, many will come from the east and the west, will literally recline at this banquet table alongside Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, which is established on earth.
So it's a truly global celebration, but with Jerusalem as the undeniable center of worship and government.
Absolutely. The prophet Zechariah, again in chapter 14, details this magnificent mandatory annual pilgrimage. All of the nations of the world that survive the initial judgment must travel to Jerusalem every single year.
To do what?
To worship King Jesus and to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. This feast historically commemorated God's provision during the Exodus wanderings and looked forward to the final ingathering. And Zechariah adds a kicker. If any nation refuses to come up and participate, they will receive no rain that year. It's the ultimate act of universal homage and submission to the enthroned Messiah King.
But as you stressed earlier, before the universal feasting, there's the judgment. The Messianic kingdom actually begins with Jesus separating the righteous nations from the wicked ones.
Yes, that's the very first order of business. It's the judgment of the nations, described vividly by the prophet Joel and, of course, by Jesus himself in Matthew chapter 25. The nations are metaphorically gathered in the valley of Jehoshaphat, a name that literally means Yahweh judges.
And how are they judged? What's the criterion?
Jesus says he will separate them like a shepherd separates sheep from goats. And the basis for separation is incredibly specific and powerful. It's based entirely on how those nations and the individuals within them treated Jesus' brethren. which in this context explicitly refers to the suffering Jewish people during that final terrible period, the time of Jacob's distress.
So the implication is that the fate of Gentile nations and individuals hinges significantly on their solidarity with or persecution of Israel during that final tribulation.
That's precisely the implication drawn by the sources. They argue that the actions of Gentiles toward the Jewish people during this future crisis are absolutely central to their own eternal judgment. They specifically highlight contrasting examples from history as models.
Like who?
Like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor who actively resisted the Nazified state church and its complicity, versus the Ten Boom family in Holland, who were staunch, unapologetic restorationists motivated by their faith to break the law and risk everything to hide and rescue Jews.
So these are held up as models for future Gentile believers facing similar pressures.
Exactly. They're presented as examples of the imperative, the moral and spiritual necessity for Gentile believers to stand with the Jewish people during times of intense persecution, knowing that how they act in that crisis has direct eternal consequences, according to Jesus' own words in Matthew 25.
Wow. Okay, looking back across this whole massive narrative, what really stands out is how incredibly specific and interwoven it all is. From that initial covenant proposal at Sinai, right through to the final triumph on Zion.
The synthesis is really quite remarkable when you lay it all out. The Exodus serving as the betrothal prototype, the recurring cycle of prophetic chastisement, culminating in Jacob's trouble and the scattering, and finally the triumphant return, modeled as a second Exodus leading to restoration on Zion. It forms this incredibly cohesive, deeply Jewish, and detailed roadmap for how history culminates.
It resolves a lot of seeming contradictions, doesn't it? By showing this linear faithfulness to the original covenant promises.
It really does. It grounds the entire redemption story, bringing clarity to what can often feel like a very confusing and fragmented topic in prophecy.
And it anchors it all in covenant faithfulness.
Ultimately, yes.
Yeah.
The Bible's central overarching promise, that fundamental declaration, YHVH will be Israel's God and they will be his people, that promise finally reaches its glorious culmination in the restored relationship of the new covenant, fully realized in the Messianic kingdom. The ultimate end state is one of perfect, unhindered dwelling, just as Revelation 21 describes it. God himself dwelling physically among his people, and no more death, no more mourning, no crying, no pain, forever.
That is an incredibly powerful trajectory to end on, but let's just loop back for final thought to that ancient prophetic theme you touched on right at the start. This idea of God's ongoing battle against and ultimate defeat of chaos, the chaos camp you called it. That seems to bookend the entire biblical story.
It really does. And understanding that ancient Near Eastern concept is actually pretty foundational for grasping the sheer scope of the final restoration promised. This struggle against chaos, the chaos camp, is right there in Genesis 1, where God brings order to the formless, watery abyss, the Tiahom. Then it reappears dramatically at the Exodus. The crossing of the Red Sea is often poetically depicted in the Psalms and prophets as YHVH, defeating the sea dragon Leviathan, a symbol of chaos, and specifically the power of Egypt. God's crushing the forces of chaos established his sovereignty over the destructive powers of the world.
And the reemergence of that same chaos symbolism marks the beginning of the final conflict.
Exactly. According to the sources, particularly interpreting Revelation, at the very end of the age, that ancient sea dragon, representing Satan and the forces of chaos, reemerges. He conjures up the beast coming up out of the sea in Revelation 13, this ultimate anti-creation figure to wage final war against God's order and God's people. So the final battle is fundamentally a cosmic rematch, a fight to undo God's established creation.
A fight which the returning Messiah decisively wins.
Decisively crushes, yes.
So, if this prophetic battle against chaos, symbolized by the sea dragon Leviathan, is seen at creation, during the Exodus, and is only truly and finally resolved at the Messiah's return, what deeper implications might that have for how we or how you should view the ongoing struggle against chaos in our current world? Political chaos, social upheaval, environmental disorder.
That's the provocative question, isn't it? The implication is that the ultimate restoration promised isn't just spiritual or individual, it's cosmic and physical. It mirrors the original act of creation, bringing perfect order out of disorder. The divine warrior isn't returning merely to save souls, he's returning to reclaim the entire physical structure of the world, to subdue all chaos, and subject everything to his perfect justice, righteousness, and peace.
Right.
And perhaps the most profound picture of this total victory comes from the prophet Habakkuk. He says in Habakkuk 2.14, that when this final chaos camp is won, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Think about the reversal in that image.
The chaotic waters, the Tihom, the sea that once symbolized the threat to creation and had to be subdued, will become the very measure, the very metaphor, for the totality of God's manifest glory covering a fully redeemed and ordered earth forever. That, the sources suggest, is the true mind-bending scope of the final triumph.